Welcome to 3 Point Cyber, a podcast about cybersecurity topics and events for the layperson. The ideas, opinions, and discussions of this podcast are those of the host, co-host, and guest, and do not necessarily represent the views of their respective employers or affiliates. Recording and propagation of this podcast is highly encouraged as long as an acknowledgement is given to the ownership. Music and graphics used in the podcast and promotional materials cannot be used in other events not tied to the podcast without the express written consent from Alpha Omega Advisors. Well, welcome back to 3 Point Cyber. I'm excited again to have another episode under our belt. Feels like we've been doing this a while, Andrew, but we really haven't. We don't have that many, just beginning of the years when we started. So how are you doing?
I'm doing good, and thinking about some of the guests we've had on who, can count their episodes in the hundreds. Yeah, we'll get there one of these days, God willing.
100 of them when you release 2 a month. That's a long ways down the road. Well, hopefully the content here is good. I try to get feedback from our listeners, so if you do have something you would like as a topic for our podcast, please email us at 3pointcyber@gmail.com. Give us your comments, your recommendations, anything you would like to know about, or just have general questions. We would certainly entertain and get back with you on those. And again, that's 3pointcyber@gmail.com. It's the number 3, spelled out point, P-O-I-N-T, cyber, C-Y-B-E-R, 3pointcyber@gmail.com. We would really welcome some feedback. Well, we've got a great guest on today, and I'm excited to have him here. Pete Herzog, located in Spain. And if you are not familiar with him, and I'm going to say this, not very many people in the cyber field are not familiar with Pete. He has some great things going on. He's been around for a while, and he has some publications that are just absolutely fantastic, and I highly recommend his work. And we're going to be bringing him on to talk a little bit more about that and some of the details and maybe some of the latest stuff that he's got going on. So right after this, you got something, Andrew?
I got to say, I like him already. He's got a great last name. I'm hoping that somewhere down the line, he's related to my all-time favorite St. Louis Cardinal manager.
St. Louis Cardinal manager, yeah. We'll find out. How about that? Okay, well, right after this, we'll bring Pete on. Welcome back to 3 Point Cyber. Andrew, I'm about ready to get started with our guest, Pete.
All right.
Is there anything specifically you'd kind of like to bring up before we do get started into that?
I think we're ready to go.
Okay, well, good. Well, Pete Herzog is an experienced security expert with a lot of time in the trenches. He's in both offense and defense work in cyber. His title on his LinkedIn profile is a hacker, discrete problem solver, and a straight shooter. He's a great guy to get to know, and the work that he does is absolutely fantastic, and I've been a fan, unbeknownst to him, for quite a while. I do watch him a lot on LinkedIn, and hence the reason why I wanted to have him on one of our podcasts. He's an expert in security tactics, which is making operations follow business strategy securely, something that I am very akin to as a CISO and now a VP for an organization that is over their cyber program. Extremely important to have your business strategy secured and your program wrapped around the business. So let's see, what else can I bring up about Pete? He's got a lot of stuff going on, and we're going to get to in just a second. He does startups in cyber, and he has quite a few going. He has shown startups how to change products to reach their full potential and multinationals on how to overcome growing pains in security and privacy. He does this through the Institute for Security and Open Methodologies, shortly known as ISECOM, the global organization he co-founded to research security, trust, and privacy in people, networks, systems, and processes. He promotes the best traits of hackers: resourcefulness, discovery, deep dive research, learning from failure, problem solving, and empathy. Pete, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's really great you having me on here. Yeah, I'm honored. Thanks.
Let me hear a little bit about you and your background and how you got started in all of this.
Oh, well, I guess I sort of started in physical security back in college. I was doing beer stings for a convenience store chain. So the district manager would drive me around to all the different stores, and I was 18 years old, and I would go in and try to buy beer. It's basically social engineer, since you had to be 21. And it was a weird time. I mean, it was strangely empowering, right? So I would go in and I would try to buy beer. Yeah, and if they sold it to me, they got fired on the spot. They even risked going to jail in certain cases, like, so this was really what the store chain did to make sure that they didn't end up in a lawsuit, because it's really expensive for them if something happens. Obviously, I mean, we're talking tens of millions or more. But the problem was I didn't have the actual heart, because the thing is, that's, I think, when I started learning how good I might actually be at social engineering, when I really wanted to do something. And so when they actually sold to me, I would get them off the hook. And I remember this one woman who, it was in some small town, probably 10 people live there, convenience store there, gas station. And I pull up, district manager's in the car, and go inside, go get myself a 6-pack of beer, and bring it to the counter. And she starts to ring me up. And I know that they're recording me from the car. And I said, no, I do not have ID. And then I just walked away, leaving the beer on the counter. And I ended up going back the next day when she was working, and explained to her that she absolutely cannot sell beer, and it was a beer sting, and she failed. But this only happened maybe 4 times, I think, where I had to actively let them know they shouldn't be selling to me.
Wow, that's interesting. I think this is the first. I've not heard of a beer sting before. So I'm curious, was this in Spain?
No, this was in New York State, upstate New York.
Really?
So,
here in the States?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I grew up in, so here you can drink with like 16.
Well, that's what I was thinking. And it kind of makes more sense to do it in a place where the drinking age is lower than it is higher, because obviously, for obvious reasons. But yeah, here it's 21.
Right. So I was actually in college at the time. I grew up in, I was born in Brooklyn, and I grew up in New York State. So I spent my formative years upstate in the Lake George area. That's where I ended up getting into that. And then the interesting thing, though, about that is that I learned a lot about how to steal beer from the store. Because I learned where all their security was and how they protected it and exactly what they did. So, of course, my friends and I never had a shortage of beer that summer. And
to this day, you drank for free.
Exactly. So, I mean, everybody wins. But then I ended up working there was a cinema chain, and I started working for them. And I was a projectionist from the age of 16 on. And I was just good at catching people stealing. And so I started doing that as well. And I was going around to different cinema chains where I would work for a weekend as a new employee, and I would just keep an eye open on who was stealing. And I would be able to catch them pretty quick and then report them at the end of the night. I didn't feel so bad about that because I wasn't social engineering them. They were just stealing, they were flat out thieving. So I would just report them and they were out.
Why do I get the feeling that you have a long list of enemies?
Probably. I probably do.
Yeah.
And that's why you're in Spain.
And that's
exactly,
exactly what I was going to say. That's why you're no longer
away.
Okay, so work with ISECOM. How did that start?
So I ended up going to Germany in '97 to work for IBM's very first hacking service. So this was when it's all brand new, and they were going to get into hacking as a service, which they called e-security, I think, at the time. Really daring of them. And I was hired and brought to Germany. I had a nice cushy job at Intel, which ended up, it's funny because shortly after I left, the entire department got sold off to somebody else during the .com thing. And they ended up probably lasting only 3 months before that shut down. But it was interesting. So I ended up dodging that. I got to Germany, worked for IBM. And then after that, so I kind of cut my teeth on becoming a hacker there, like the business side. I had a good mentor who taught me a lot about what I didn't know. I was humbled often. I worked with a lot of the greats like Bill Cheswick, Vitsa Venema. They're all IBMers. So Bill did a lot with early firewalls, and Vitsa, who's the one who wrote Satan, which is the very first scanning tool. I got to work with a lot of great people and got to learn about the business of security. But I kind of also learned that something was wrong. Like we weren't actually fixing things. Like something was, we were finding vulnerabilities, but we weren't really improving security. And it really bugged me. And so I thought the problem might be that we weren't thorough enough in how we were testing or what we were looking at. And so at some point, I ended up moving to Spain. I got married. My wife was Catalan, and so we ended up moving to this area here. And this was, about 2000. And so I had a lot of time on my hands because as an American, I couldn't just move to Spain and work. I needed working papers and all that good stuff. So a lot of waiting in lines and getting the right paperwork and all that kind of stuff. And the funny thing is that I think it only took me 3 days to find a job from when I left Germany to when I came here. Deutsche Bank hired me immediately, helped me get my papers together. They paid for it and everything because there was such a need for security. But back then it was all PKI. That's what they wanted me to do originally. Mm-hmm. But I had a lot of time in my hands, and I was a lot of train rides, plane rides, and I was just always thinking about how to improve it. And so at some point, after working for Deutsche Bank for a while and really sort of figuring out what I wanted to do, and in my off time writing the OSTEM, writing out this stuff, which was only, I think, like 12 pages, the first one I published. I put it online. There was no, what was everybody using? The security mailing lists.
Mm-hmm.
I posted
and you're
there.
Referring now to your OSTEM, right?
So,
and that is open source security testing methodology manual.
Right, okay. Right. So that was the OSTEM, and I only put it out there because I was trying to figure out. I wanted other people to see it and see if I could get more thorough on what we were testing and how. I hadn't even begun any real research, just trying to assimilate all the stuff I've learned over time. And I put it out there, and there was a lot of feedback. People were really interested in having it.
You're up to version 3 right now. I can attest that it is a really well-written manual, a lot of good information in it. And for our listeners, if your security team or you have more interest in learning a little bit about methodologies of security, I would highly recommend that you download that and give it a good read. It's one of those gems that can be hidden, and if you don't know what's out there, you're missing out a lot. I really do back it, Pete, and I think it's a great piece of work.
Thanks. I mean, the interesting thing is that I never really took off in the U.S. As a matter of fact, it was very big in Canada. It was huge in Mexico. So in Canada, Bell Canada was representing it. They had it out everywhere. Mexico, it even made it to the point where to get a government job, including banks, which are half owned by the government, you had to be OSTEM certified or one of the others that they had. So we ended up doing a lot there. Federal government in the U.S., we did trainings for Department of Justice, FBI, NSA, NASA. I know NIST subscribed and had gotten versions of the OSTEM. As a matter of fact, 853, when they released the draft, had direct quotes, whole paragraphs from the OSTEM as they were doing it.
Yeah, but I'm a big NIST user myself. Well, that's what I implement. But I can also say that a lot of your content is things that I subscribe to when I'm building security programs. So even though you may not think it has taken off much in the United States, it's out here more than you think it is.
Well, that's good to hear. I don't really get much feedback otherwise.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about ISECOM. You went over how you started it and founded it. Now let's get to the nitty gritty. How should we really use it? What's it for?
So basically, the OSTEM grew so fast that we set up a nonprofit organization to basically house it and maintain it, make sure that we had the money to do it. Co-founded with my wife. She ended up doing all the back office stuff. She's a computer scientist, so she did a lot of the setting up the servers, the dev work, all that stuff. I mean, and then of course all the financial stuff. I focused on just running the projects. So
you have to ask this though. Let's go back to your beer sting. I'm still finding that a little fascinating. I'm surprised Andrew hasn't spoken up and said something about it yet. But your wife, your wife?
My signal.
Andrew, you're not one he is caught at, are you? It's taken you a little while to answer that one.
Well, maybe 30 years ago.
Oh, I see. Well, I guess I'm asking now. You when you met your wife, your wife wasn't one of these people that you met during a sting. And
no.
Good.
No, my wife is from here. Not that was all in New York.
Okay.
So.
And as a security guy, did you do a background check on her?
Actually, I didn't. It all moved really quickly. So we knew each other. We met. We worked in the same department. I ended up working at another company. She was there, and we got to know each other as colleagues. We were in the same department. We started dating, and 3 weeks later, I asked her to marry me.
Well, good.
So it went really fast.
There it is. That is pretty fast. I'm kind of cringing at no background check with a 3-week.
I think I say bravo because sometimes you just don't want to know.
Okay, well, we've got a little off topic here. There's one other thing that came out of all of this, Pete, that I want to bring up too, because I think it's a fantastic program. And as you and I were talking before the podcast, it is here in the United States a little bit more probably more than your manual is, a methodology manual is, and probably by different names, but it's Hacker High School. Can you tell me a little bit about Hacker High School and why you decided to do that?
Sure. So ISECOM became a certification authority, and we worked with LaSalle University in the beginning to get the credentials in order to do that. And as we were training security professionals, one of the things that came to light was that the younger they were, the better they seemed to do on the exams, the better they seemed to do in learning this stuff and applying this stuff. So I was talking to a colleague, and I said, how young do you think we can go? And he said, well, our university has a bunch of high schools associated with it. Why don't we try that? So that was where the idea was. That was back in 2003. We ended up building what now is known as a cyber range. Nothing like that had ever existed before. So we built a cyber range for them to practice. And we had built it out already so that there was a practical aspect to the certification exams that we gave. So it all sort of went together. We built that out and we started teaching young people. And the stupid idea I had was that we would teach teachers who would then bring these to students, and then we could teach more teachers. And that was the idea, except for the fact that teachers have so much on their plates, they weren't really interested in it. Not only that, but the name Hacker High School was just toxic to them. It was poison, it was school poison.
Well,
they did not want the name.
Yeah, it's that term hacker.
Yeah. So we ended up doing that and trying for a while, trying to get out there. We made all these lessons, 12 lessons in all, and we tried to do it, but we just could not get it in schools. Nobody would touch it, except for the university who ended up bringing it out to their schools. And there was a few. It was interesting. Military schools and far-right religious schools seemed to love it. Now, what a lot of people don't know about Hacker High School is it's basically the OSTEM rewritten into stories. That's all it is. So it is the OSTEM itself. They learn all of this stuff. And sorry, I think Andrew has a question. He's waving and I'm distracted.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, so you mentioned, actually, I've got several questions that I've got to back up here.
Okay.
But the first one I'm going to ask is, you mentioned cyber range. What do you mean by cyber range?
So a cyber range is basically a computer or network of computers that you can practice on that doesn't then spill over and infect other computers or over the internet. So it's a safe place to practice.
Okay, so it's a closed network.
Yeah, it's a closed, sealed network that can't leak out if you're practicing with malware or attacks, that kind of thing. And usually it can be easily reset, so there's no damage done.
Okay, and do the schools have to provide that environment?
Well, if they want to teach anybody how to do something, if you're going to teach them to shoot a gun, you provide a firing range, right? So, I mean, you normally they do. And since we knew they couldn't at the time, it was 2003, we built it, hosted it at the university, and we gave free access to everyone who wanted it.
Okay, so when you do you do that, talking about going to high schools, do you provide that at the high schools as well?
No. So what ended up happening was we failed spectacularly, learning the fact that teachers can't continue doing, they didn't want to learn this or it was just too much for them. So what we ended up doing back in about 2011, 2012, we rewrote all the lessons so that they were written so that the kids teach themselves, like hackers do. And they learn by themselves. They share information in the groups. They can practice. We had to stop. It got so successful then we had to stop offering the free cyber range because we couldn't fit that many people. And this was before cloud computing became a thing as well. So this was an issue. And I mean, we really just had a bunch of old PCs with a lot of network cards. Like it wasn't anything fancy. So we had to rewrite everything, and it was slow taking off also because the name, nobody wanted to touch the name hacker, because it was associated with criminals. Unlike, I think more and more today, people recognize hackers not necessarily synonymous with criminal. It's just somebody who's clever with computers, which was the original name anyways. And so what we did is around 2014, we said that this is it. We're going to close the program because it was a huge drain on resources. We said we're going to stop this project if it doesn't get picked up somewhere. And 2014, it got picked up by RSA. They invited us to come 5 years in a row. We spoke about it. They paid for us to be there. They provided the section for us to talk about it. They provided us presentation times. I mean, it was really great. And that happened at the same time that one of the schools, I think it was in New Jersey, I talked to a director there, and she said, I'm tired of our teachers printing out all your PDFs. Can you just make a book? We'll buy the books. And I said, oh, I didn't realize this was an issue, right? So, I mean, we had the free PDFs online. So we ended up, I think we knew we were going to RSA. So we had 4 weeks to print all the books, to get all the books ready for print, which we did. We did a book a week. We ended up making 4 books, 3 books. A fourth was another one, it was a story. But so we ended up making 4 books in those 4 weeks from the material. We got a good volunteer team together to help stretch that out, make it better, add more content. So we really grew it a lot. And we took those books then to RSA. I don't remember how many we brought. It's the big conference for security out in San Francisco.
It's one of the largest cybersecurity conferences in the world, Andrew.
Okay, that's BCSF, big conference, San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah, we'll go with that.
That's for one of our acronym episodes we need to put in there, Andrew. I'm going to throw this in here real quick in case people are wondering. We're talking about Hacker High School that Pete actually helped co-found or found. Did you?
I co-founded it with my wife. Yeah.
Right, and then that's part of the ISECOM organization that he's with, and that's at isecom.org. Hacker High School can be found at hackerhighschool.org. And everything about it is on there. And basically, he had done this with a target, basically of 12 to teenage years, 12 to 20-year-olds. But I can tell you, as I've read through these as well, this is for almost for anyone that has an interest in cybersecurity and wants to learn more. And it is very well written and is easy to understand. Hence, again, why I've been a fan of Pete's for quite a while and wanted him to come on here. So, Pete, kudos to you in this. I think it's great, and hopefully we can get some more traction going on it.
So, another question that I've got for you, because you mentioned certification. So you're involved with the Institute for Security and
Open Methodologies. Yeah, that's our organization, ISECOM. Yep.
So you are a certifier, and okay.
So we certify professionals and businesses. So we have businesses who get the OSTEM audits done. They get certified. So that's something that's been growing a lot. They get a security test that's OSTEM certifiable by an actual OSTEM professional security tester, who they themselves as professionals have to be certified as well in that testing and analysis. But we have a bunch of certifications. As a matter of fact, we had a new certification about 3 years ago directly for NATO and Cyber Command in Poland that we only teach to military personnel. That's a whole other one. But this is something that I don't know. I don't talk about it much because we've always done it, and it doesn't seem new or spectacular to me at all. It's just a job, you know. So
Pete, is this
it is a big deal.
Has this certification, is it any countries in Europe, is that starting to be a requirement for certain companies right now?
Requirement, I think so. I mean, again, we're as a nonprofit, we've been really bad at maintaining or watching these kinds of things. I do know that throughout Europe, it is pretty well known. It's used in lieu of when they say you must have this kind of certification. So for some kind of compliance, it's often accepted. Actually, it does pretty well around the world. It's just not within the compliance rules for anything in the United States.
Got it.
And part of that's my fault. Back in like 2006 to 2008, somewhere in there, I was invited to DC to be part of this and decide what certifications. So they brought in a bunch of this is capitalism at work, right? They brought in a bunch of these commercial companies that sold these certifications, and they got to vote on which ones. And of course, everybody voted for themselves. And us with our little nonprofit, I was like, yeah, I can't fly to DC for the day. I can't afford that, you know? So we didn't go. And so we didn't end up in those compliance objectives for the U.S.
Well, interestingly enough, Pete, so you know, there's just not a lot of mandated certifications here in the United States anyway. And I think that's starting to change. There are a few, and it depends on what sector you're in. Healthcare has only one certification, and it's not mandated. Obviously, the more regulated side is our financials.
Yeah, it's a funny thing you bring up finance because I was brought over. They built a new stock exchange called IEX Trading in New York, and they brought me in to do their security from core to door. Now, you might have heard of IEX because they were what's his name? Jack Lewis wrote a book about them. He's the one who wrote Moneyball. I'm probably getting his name wrong. He wrote about them called Fast Boys, I want to say it was called. And yeah, so I was there actually when he was interviewing them, and they were building out the speed bump for high frequency traders, and so I was involved in security and looking at the fraud aspects of what can happen. And I ended up securing them from core to door. That was really my main job, and trying to look into it. There was a huge research thing I did about the closed internet for finance, which was really interesting as well. It's like everything you want the internet to be, but faster and cooler. And it's just to minimize fraud and the kinds of attacks that they had on there and this kind of thing. But it was interesting because I did the security, and then they had to go through the compliance check, and they had to undo some of the security I did just to check a box, you know?
That doesn't surprise me. It's unfortunate, but we have a lot of companies here that do security through compliance. And as you know, that's a horrible way to do security. Just have a checklist of things that you can have in place, because that does not mean compliance does not equal security. You can be 100% compliant to a lot of regulations over here, and that does not mean your company is secure.
Sure. Yeah, but that's been an ongoing problem for a long time. And again, it comes down to writing the check. That's all you have to do. Mm-hmm. It's probably one of the reasons why our certifications also hadn't been that popular, because it wasn't easy to get. So I had worked on some of the early stuff, the earliest stuff, or some of the, I probably shouldn't name drop because I'm going to talk bad about them, for one of the early certifications. And their mandate to me was that 95% of the people had to pass, or else otherwise they had to provide free training for those who failed. And so that's when we said, let's go our own way completely with this and not help out other certifications. And I would say those who study and do well, I mean, we do pretty well on the tester. The analyst certification people find a lot harder. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you, we get somewhere between 50 and 60% of the people failing because it's hard. But we try to maintain a baseline of the minimum that somebody should know as a security professional.
Well, and I hope you stick to that, Pete. We're over here. We talk about certifications quite a bit here in the States, at least among the cyber community. And I would tell you that overwhelming majority of us that are in higher levels of the security programs and executive levels and CISOs will tell you that we're certification fatigued. There are so many certifications for individuals that we look at them and think we don't really understand what that even means anymore. There are still some great certifications out there, but there are also certifications that just are not worth the paper they're printed on. And a lot of it is just that stuff that you kind of go through, and you could read a 3-page summary of something and go pass a test, and now you're certified in the field, and that's just not a good certification to have. So you stand pat with that thinking about making it worth something. And I think what we're seeing here is to change, which is why I'm encouraging you to keep up the push to do company certifications, because I think that's where we're going. We're starting to see the shift from individuals that are in the field certifications to company certifications. And I think that's what's being played out here, at least in the United States, that I'm hearing. How do we get companies certified to at least get to a baseline level of security? And I think a lot of that's even being driven by the insurance industry and the problems we're having with cyber insurance and companies dropping insurance or raising rates and not able to cover everything. And I think that's what all of this is culminating into another change. I think it's a paradigm shift, what I'm calling in cybersecurity.
I hope it happens. I mean, like I said, the business certification thing has been growing. Now we do something a little bit different. So, the awesome, I would say the main point of the awesome is the fact that we figured out how to measure security. So we measure an attack surface so they can get a score. And we have a calculation sheet that is then followed by those who test. And then, that certification is based on that score. But there's no failing. Like, you get certified that you have had an awesome test and this is the score you have. And it depends, right? It depends on what we were testing, because anybody can try to fake the scope by, okay, you're not testing this, you're testing this. And this is what we want to be graded on, right? Because they know that particular thing is good. And so what we ended up doing is we implement this thing called a STAR, Security Test Audit Report. And what they end up doing is they do the test, they fill out the STAR. Now, the STAR serves two roles. One is that it's something you deliver to the company that shows it's a whole list of what was tested and what was not tested. So it gives you a list and they can say yes, yes, no, no. And if it's no, they can give a reason, such as customer said out of scope. Yeah. And so what happens is, and this was the main reason why we ended up doing this originally, was because companies were suing security testing companies because they got breached later. And then they said, oh, no, we were tested and it's their fault. And they had no paperwork to say, no, this was out of scope and I have to go to court and everything. And this gave an actual certified stamped document that let them say, hey, this is what you told us not to test, and you signed off on it. And it was sort of a protection for the security company, as well as now I would say protection for the company themselves, because they could show through compliance exactly what they did have tested. And again, since security, and this is actually a very important point, there's a lot of balance in security. So depending on your operations, and as you have more operations, that gets you more exposed, increases your attack surface. And in order to control that, you have to have a certain type of balance. And so we know, looking at the numbers, basically how secure, how well they're doing as far as their attack surface goes. That has nothing to do with the fact that they got a low-ish score or a high score. I mean, it does to some degree, but it also depends on where it was in the scope. Was this an internal thing? Was this external? Was this their DMZ? So it was all about knowing where we were testing. We do a lot of physical testing stars as well. That's something actually that's been growing a lot.
Well, I think what you're seeing, and we're seeing that as well here. A marrying up of physical security and cybersecurity is occurring, and we're starting to see systems being integrated with our physical security stuff and our cyber stuff, because there's a lot of overlap now, specifically with social engineering. That's where it starts. It really starts in the physical realm and then moves its way into the electronic.
So in the Austin, we actually split that into what we call channels. A channel is something where you need specific tools and specific know-how in order to test and analyze it. So for example, wireless is a channel. Data networks is a channel. Telecommunications is a channel. Humans are a channel. Yeah. So because of social engineering. And the idea here is that you follow this thing called the 4-point process, which is you look at the environment, you look at the emanations, you look at the interactions, and you look at the resources that it requires. And these 4 things, and for each channel, you go through those 4 things. And it's a methodology, right? It's a method that you do for testing. And that way you don't say that, hey, they're secure, and then they fall to social engineering or phishing, or they didn't lock down their Wi-Fi. And of course, we're seeing now new channels emerging. We have a quantum channel, we have an AI channel, and we have some other new ones that are developing as technology develops.
Good. Andrew, you have any questions on that?
Something that had not occurred to me until you mentioned the word, auditing, and it sounds like certification is just for what you do is another term for audit. But I would think that, what you do, if you take it into the world of finance, for example, auditing firms, auditing companies, financials that banks rely on, and, these companies that have cooked the books, the auditing firm gets in trouble, sometimes can go under based on the good audits that they gave that were not actually good. And thinking in terms of context of what you do, which you could probably be held to the same liability standards that in those circumstances.
So, Pete, if I may real quick, just throw this in here. Andrew's bringing up the differences between assessments and audits and certifications, and there is a big difference between them. Probably audit and certifications are closer related than assessments, because assessments are done typically in a point of time to whatever's going on in an organization, whatever controls they have in place. Whereas an audit or a certification, there's verifications behind what they say they're doing, and it's not, or at least they're supposed to be. The ones that are worth their weight, there's verifications that are going on. If I say I'm doing something, then typically I have to prove that I'm doing and show results of what I'm doing.
For 22 years of running an international organization, terminology has been the biggest hobgoblin that we have because we rely on English, but nobody can agree on what these terms actually mean in America alone. Now go to the greater English-speaking community and go internationally, and everybody's going to argue. And so what we try to do is step back and sort of say, what do you want me to mean by this? And try to get definitions to things. I mean, I don't know if you noticed in the OSTEM itself, we put a lot of definitions and people argue that, oh, that's not what authentication means. The reason why we did that was you can't have good scientific discourse until you actually describe what it is you're trying to say, especially in a field where everybody's just making up their own terms to sell last year's product as new again, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess my overall point or what I thought about was just the U.S. is a very litigious place. We're always looking for, who's liable, who's at fault. And it just occurred to me, say a bank, for example, is giving a loan to a company, but requires a certification, and you are one of those certifying authorities, but it requires a certain certification for cybersecurity, and you give that stamp of approval, much like an audit firm would give that stamp of approval on the finance side. Yeah, could the bank turn around, and something happens and join you in a suit?
So we're very specific about what this means. I see what you're saying now. So when a security testing firm does a test and they complete a STAR, a security test audit report, basically that is their indemnification that this is what I tested and this is what I didn't, and I'm signing off on it. And the person who signs off has to be certified. Okay, so they have to be ISECOM certified, and they sign off and they put their certification number there showing that they've done it. We then certify that the report was filled out correctly and done with the information correctly. We don't certify, we certify that they were legit, that they were certified to do the test, and we certify that the report was done correctly, and it gets a stamp and an actual certification that they have then for their own paper records, because another thing they can do is also show improvement over time. And the only thing that this really provides is indemnification, right? So again, since there's no good or bad, there's a score, and that score shows their balance of their operations to their limitations, to their vulnerabilities, to the things they don't control, their lack of controls. And this balance is all we're trying to show in this number, or actually it's a bunch of numbers that they'll see, and not that they're a good company or they can't be attacked or they can be attacked. None of that is being said. It's only for authenticating and authorizing that this was done correctly.
It's part of a validation.
Yeah,
validation.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think, Andrew, what you're talking about is the company that's doing the certification setting themselves up for liability in what they say.
Yeah, and just for one thing, for anybody who's listening that, maybe a CPA, and I'm not saying that, all, say audit firms automatically are liable.
Actually, we have some really big companies throughout Europe that get the STAR, really big, well-known, and they mainly do it on a yearly basis because they have parent companies and they want to be able to track what happens every year if security is remaining consistent, and that it's also proof that they do get a good test done and that it's looked after. That's the best that we can do. Right now, other than that, there's nothing. There's really nothing. You can go get an ISO certification, pay a check, and somebody will sign the paper. This is the problem that you're having. And believe me, we took the OSTEM through ISO, trying to get it to become part of ISO. And it was such a disaster, the whole thing on how it played out. Mm-hmm. And I'm surprised Netflix hasn't done a documentary already on how the system works for ISO, because I was unpleasantly surprised over the whole.
I tell you what, I've done ISO certifications, not in cyber, in other areas with companies. I'm not an ISO fan. I have no problems with saying so. I think it is one of those things that it got so big with the proper people doing their pushing and getting the right people to listen. And I think most of the ISO certifications are exactly what I mentioned earlier. It's a point in time. There are companies that know how to pass an ISO certification. Does not necessarily mean they're doing everything that ISO says. Now, I'm not intending to do ISO bashing, but that's what I don't want to see fall our certifications, if we go down that route, to fall in that kind of a problem, because I want a certification to mean something, and I want to know if I've got a certification on a company or an individual, that certification, I know that person has gone through rigorous controls and background and everything to know that they deserve that cert. And I think that's what a true certification is.
That's interesting you say that, because one of the things I help out a lot of U.S. colleges and universities, and one of the things they try to do in cyber is get them certified through one of the many, beginner certs that they have out there. And they try to push them through this so that they can get a job, but they can't get a job because they don't have experience in their basic certification. They try to choose the one that most HR companies are asking for, right? So that they can apply to these jobs. But of course, they don't really, they're good luck getting those jobs, because how you actually get jobs is by showing up, perseverance, experience, networking, all that stuff. That's how you really get a job.
And I think, Pete, you're absolutely correct. That is going on quite a bit. And that is one of the reasons why we're looking at these certs as meaningless right now, because I really think it's more of the certification authorities that are actually going out to the universities and pushing their certs and educating the education institutions that, these people are going to need these certs, and we're willing to work these deals out with you if you would push our program through your program. And I think that's what's really happening.
But now universities are being held accountable for how many people are actually getting these jobs. And they're setting up, so they're actually reaching out to us and saying, hey, what can we do to get them going? Because how we promote some of our certifications is that it's like a landing. When you get an ISECOM certified person with their OPST or OPSA, they can just start working day one. You don't have to go teach them the kitchen, like a first day waiter. No, they start to work. They have the technical skills. They got the chops that they can do it. And I think that's how anybody should be when they start a job, Yeah,
exactly. Well, we're nearing the end of our podcast. Pete, as you know, the name of this podcast is 3 Point Cyber. What we tend to do with that is to try to pull 3 points out of the discussions that we've just had. And I'm going to ask you, if you had to give 3 points to our listeners that if anything we've talked about you want them to take, what would those 3 points be?
That high school students do really, really well with learning cybersecurity. You don't have to dumb it down for them. They pick it up pretty quickly. Hacker High School is a great program for that. And as a matter of fact, we just built an AI teaching assistant so that, because one of the things is we get at least once a week an email from a teacher who says, hey, I'm the math teacher and they asked me to teach cybersecurity next semester and I have no idea what I'm doing. I found your program. And so we do have this AI teaching assistant so that the kids can actually ask the AI to help answer some of these questions. So there is a way for these young people to actually learn this, and it is beneficial because they are sponges. And whatever they pick up now is stuff they'll know for life.
Okay.
That's one point. The other point I was thinking is that one of the things that people don't really realize is that security as a whole, like everybody likes to say, security is so complicated, it's so difficult, it's hard to get right. And as we're researching it, ISECOM's mainly a research organization. We're researching OSTEM 4. We're always pushing forward. And I would say that we're about 20 years ahead of the security industry in our research. And this brings up the third point as well. Okay, when people talk about how can you have security for such advanced technology, how can you say you're advanced? Well, technology as it advances only does really three things. It makes it smarter, it makes it prettier, or it makes it faster. Okay, and that's with everything. So if you want to look at any kind of technology, how it improves anything, it's one of those three things happening. Okay, and by prettier, we can say also user experiences in there. So when people say, oh, AI is going to save security, no, it's going to make security smarter, meaning it's going to take decisions away from people who make dumb decisions. Yeah. So there are things you can do, but none of that changes the foundation of security. Like, what does that mean? How does that work? How do we actually make something secure? Because if you look at how it's being taught, you would think that the premise is making something harder to do makes it more secure. And honestly, we don't know if that's really true. It seems to be not, actually. And but you say make passwords harder, make encryption longer, make everything harder to do. But that's not necessarily true. You just actually shrink the number of people who can do those things.
Yeah, I like that, Pete. That's a great point. And Bruce Schneier probably said it best when he said, if you think technology is going to solve your security problems, then you don't understand the technology and you don't understand the problems.
Yeah, and the more we dive into security, now we threw away everything that we knew about security when we started researching it new. And it's freakishly matrix-like in its balance and patterns. It's really weird. So, for example, for every operational control, for example, authentication, for one, we're able to map that out to how it means in a time relation. And we can further map that out into a trust relation. So, for example, let's say an operational control like subjugation, where I make you follow a security protocol. You cannot choose, I don't know, what encryption mechanism for HTTPS. That is subjugated. That is a control we put in place. So we force you to use our protocol our way. That's a subjugation control. But there's places you can't do that because you'll lose customers, you'll lose interactions, you'll lose things. Well, there is a balanced trust property that basically said, which is surveillance. So whatever, if I can't make you do it, I can watch you to see if you do it. And so for every single one of the 12 trust properties, there is a corresponding control.
Right.
And it goes both ways. And we're finding more and more of these balances and patterns that keep showing up, which is interesting because the more we find, the more holes we find that we can fill and learn more about security. And I think a lot of people don't realize that security is not hard. We just haven't really figured out how it really works yet.
Exactly. Great conversation. Great points, Pete. I really appreciate it. Andrew, you have any parting thoughts or questions?
Well, I have one last question, which is probably the most important question. I find it interesting that you brought up Moneyball earlier in this conversation. So are you related to Whitey Herzog?
As far as I know, I'm not, or Werner Herzog, the director. As a matter of fact, it's unfortunately...
Werner Herzog?
Yeah, I'm also not, or Andrea Herzog, the football player. I mean, it's a fairly common European name as a title. It's sort of like king or prince at home, I guess, is the last name.
Okay.
Yeah. But, you know,
I won't hold that against her. That's fine.
I mean, I wish I was related to more famous people. It would have made life a lot easier, I would hope.
Well, the only one that matters to Andrew would have been Whitey. He's a staunch St. Louis Cardinal baseball fan, and you can't help it.
and I'm sure there are plenty of people who wish they were related to you.
There you go.
That's very nice to say. Thank you. And I'll tell you what, the next time, I've been doing a lot more celebrity work lately, helping them get unhacked and solve some of their problems. And if anything revolves around baseball, I will reach out to you and I will make sure that I involve you. Yeah?
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Sounds good. We'd be more than happy to help. So, Pete, really, thank you very much for taking the time to do this podcast with us. And the more we can get this information out in an easier understanding format, the better off we're all going to be. We're really trying to present cyber in an easy-to-understand way and get those topics out there for a lot better awareness. So I really appreciate the time you've taken.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Andrew, for your help as well.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to 3 Point Cyber, a production from Alpha Omega Advisors. If you have questions about this episode or have a topic for discussion or a guest you would like us to have on, please email us at 3pointcyber@gmail.com. That's 3, the number 3, point, P-O-I-N-T, cyber, C-Y-B-E-R, all one word, 3pointcyber@gmail.com. We encourage you to share this podcast with others. This podcast is owned and produced by Alpha Omega Advisors. The theme song was created by music producer Andrew Van Wert in Nashville, Tennessee. This is Dave Summit, and until next time, keep on learning.